answer was that he was speaking Sanskrit. When I posed this question to one of the professors, then he or she, the name is not important, then he said that, if you are insinuating that he would be speaking Sanskrit in that time, then you must be a right-wing person. Now that is the contestation in Indian history from which we have to come out, we have to find a way out. And that is where Indologists like Dr. Koernaad Elst comes very handy, and his contribution has been immense. He has written books such as Ayodhya and After, Issues Before Hindu Society, Negationism in India, Indigenous India. Then he has co-authored various books. As I have already mentioned, he was a freelance journalist. And as being a student of JU, we know that every year some kind of rituals which is very unfortunate is observed in JU. Like whenever it's 6th December, we see whole campus is plastered with never forgive, never forget. And at that time, what people always forget is that the whole history has been kind of negated in pursuit of parochial political interest. And my problem and the problem of most of us is that we do not know our history. And what we do not know, actually it's very difficult to know about what we don't know. Now it's a kind of oxymoron, but that is where the experts like Koernaad Elst would help us. I hope that we would have a very heartening evening with Dr. Koernaad Elst. Now I hand over the proceedings of the meeting to Dr. Koernaad Elst.
Mic hand.
As the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu used to say, if you know the other one and you know yourself, then you will score victory upon victory. If you don't know the other one, but at least you know yourself, it will be sometimes victory and sometimes defeat. If you know neither the other one nor yourself, then defeat upon defeat is assured. Now, the last case is the case in which Hindus find themselves. Maybe you know of exceptions, but most Hindus I meet or whom I read on the internet or in books are quite ignorant about Hinduism itself and are total babes in the wood when it comes to other worldviews. So of course I cannot deal with every subject under the sun, but I have dealt somewhat specialistically with the history pertaining to Hindus, and I've initially mostly worked on medieval history, but since some years I've been more active on ancient history, and is there where I want to start? Well, yeah, that's where I want to start, except that I will first start with a general definition of Hinduism, which is valid for ancient India, but which is still valid today. And you know, we can sort of adopt an interactive style of working, given also the nature of the audience. Does anyone know the definition of Hinduism?
It's a way of life.
It's a way of life. Oh, that's pretty general. Especially if you then ask the next question, what can you specify what that way of life is?
Like it's the way, so it's like more realizing how the God would be and practicing the past, what the God that would lead you to the nature of that God.
Well, yeah, of course, it's an approach to God, but not necessarily, because you see there have been atheist schools inside Hinduism which did not know of any God, and on the other hand, If that is the meaning, then, you know, Christianity and Islam could also say that they are a way to God or something like that. And so, you see, the function of the definition is to define limits. This belongs to it, this does not belong to it. And so, the Pope in Rome, okay, he is not a Hindu, but under your definition, he would be. So I would tend to disagree with the definition. However, I thank you at least for speaking up and speaking of mine as the first. Hinduism is very simple to define, and this is a historical definition, very solidly the first one ever, and which still generally applies. Namely, as you know, of course, the word Hindu came about as a purely geographical term, is the Persian word for India, for people living on the Indus or beyond. But it was brought into India by the Islamic invaders, and they used it in the sense of any Indian pagan. So, you know, gradually they met Christians in India and Kerala. They also met some Jews in India, also in Kerala. And so those two they knew, they were sort of, you know, related religions. So they were excluded from the term Hindu, but all Indian pagans were Hindu. For example, the Buddhists, or, you know, as the Chachnama says, clean-shaven Brahmins, that is the Buddhists. The tribals, the Lingayats, the Sikhs, who did not exist yet at the time, but, you know, they would soon, of course, also fall under the definition. The Brahmins, the low caste, the high caste, everyone. Okay? And they would all go to hell. On that, in fact, Islam and Christianity are in agreement. I don't know your religion, but most of you are definitely going to hell. So, the definition of Hindu is extremely simple. It's an Indian pagan. And that still is a valid definition. In the Hindu Code Bill in 1955, a Hindu was defined as every Indian who is not a Christian, Muslim, or a Parsi. Parsi, of course, are also pagans, but not Indian pagans. They are, by origin at least, Persian pagans. So anyway, it's a negative definition, but it is a definition that works, that includes all Hindus. And that definitely implies that controversial groups nowadays, like Buddhists, Arya Samajis, who claim not to be Hindus, Ramakrishna Mission, who claim not to be Hindus, Lingayats and so on, they are all very definitely Hindu. So Hinduism thereby is very much defined. Okay, like for example, the ancient Vedic rishis were Hindus. The priest king of Mohenjo-Daro, you know, after whom, you know, he's on the Pakistani tourist propaganda, 5,000 years of Pakistan. Okay, well, he was not a Pakistani, you know, he was a Hindu. In fact, the three main poster boys for this notion of 5,000 years of Pakistan, they were all three Hindu. The priest king, of course, you know, judging by his dress and so on, he was some kind of officiant of the stellar code of the planets or something. This is explicitly forbidden in the Quran. So he was certainly not a Muslim, so already for 4,000 years he has been burning in hell. Then you have the dancing girl. Now the dancing girl is standing there naked, you know, with a very confident look on her face. If she did that today in Pakistan, she would be stoned. And then you have the seal of the proto-Shiva, the Shiva Prasupati. That, of course, also is outright paganism, you know. So 5,000 years of Pakistan means 5,000 years of Hinduism. Okay. So we are now in ancient India, and so all the people that we're going to talk about are Hindu. It must be said, however, the word Hindu is subject to a manipulation of meanings. Like, for example, Christian missionaries and all their friends, you know, the secularists and so on, they are very insistent in saying tribals are not Hindus. But then you see, when tribals come in the news negatively, like when they react against the murder of Swami Lakshmananda, burning churches, then suddenly, oh, Christians in India are being persecuted by Hindu fundamentalists. And then suddenly the tribals become Hindus. So you see, the word Hindu is subject to a manipulation of meanings, very systematically, in fact. For example, also the word Hindu is, depending on the circumstances, depending on what is most useful, are identified with Vedic, Brahminical. And of course, I must say that Hindus themselves are very confused about this. So tribals have no temples, they worship in the open air and so on. And so all this is used to say, oh, they are not Hindus. Look, because they don't do the same things that we are seeing Hindus doing when they go to the Lakshmi Narayan Mandir or something. No, yeah. But you see, the Vedic rishis, they also had no temples. They also worshipped in the open air. When they worshipped the thunder, they did not make a statue of the thunder god. No, you see, this was the thunder that they saw in the sky. When they worshipped the sun, you know, they prayed to the rising sun, you know, Gayatri mantra and everything. And they did not make statues of the sun, they did not build temples, you know, houses for these statues. But this was all foreign to them. So if worshipping this way means not being Hindu, well, okay, then the rishis were not Hindu. But if they were Hindu, then the tribals are also Hindu. Okay. Now, where do we start with the history of India? Let's tell the whole story of mankind. You see, humanoids, human-type beings have been in India already for hundreds of thousands of years. And I say that science is not yet definitive about who is human and who is not. Were the Neanderthals humans? I think they were, but okay, this discussion. Anyway, the species to which we belong, the Homo sapiens, of that you see the history is that they left Africa about 70,000 years ago. At that time there was an earlier ice age, not the last ice age, which meant that the sea level was much lower, and that much of what is now below sea was, you know, you could walk on it. And so they walked to Yemen, across what is now the Red Sea, but it was no sea yet at that time, across the Persian Gulf, and then they reached India. And then of course they walked on. And they populated what was to become the Andaman Islands, and then later Indonesia and so on. They even managed to go to Australia, probably crossing a little bit of water, but where you could see the other side, because mankind was until very recently, 3,000, 2,000 years ago, afraid to really cross the sea. You know, they only did coastal navigation. So anyway, they populated Australia, then the sea level rose and Australia was isolated. So the Australians for a very, very long time did not mix with anyone else. The Andamanese people likewise. So in the Andamans, I don't know how it is there now, but until very recently, you had practically the most primitive people on earth living there. Well, not that primitive perhaps, because you may like to know that, well, the three most primitive populations that we know, and that were part of this early migration, namely the Bushmen of South Africa, the Andamanese, and the Aboriginals of Australia, they knew already something called Kundalini. You at least heard of Kundalini, the energy that climbs up the spine. Now, the Bushmen and the Aboriginals, and according to what I've read, also the Andamanese, have this practice of a kind of dancing, where they try to feel warmth climbing up the spine. So there are these shamans who do these spirit trips and, you know, are supposed to converse with the dead and so on. So one of their practices is to raise Kundalini. So already among the most primitive tribes of mankind, you have this awareness. I'm just telling you this, by the way. Okay, so these people go around the Indian Ocean. They live near the coast, because the coast has very many advantages. Like if tigers or other wild animals appear, you can find safety by walking into the sea. Also, and more importantly really, the temperatures there are not too extreme. You know, at night you can sleep on the beach and so on, it doesn't become too cold. Daytime is very warm, but not extremely hot. So it's a very pleasant climate. I mean, around the Indian Ocean is the best you can have. And so later you see when men become more developed, when they can, for instance, manufacture clothes, they go up north where it's colder and so where it's more difficult to survive. And that movement starts from India. So you have an immigration from India populating both, well, first Central Asia and then going to the west, Europe, and going to the east, China, Siberia, and so on. And then that population moves through Siberia to America, becoming the Native Americans and so on. But all this starts in India. Well, that's already something. But that happened 60,000 or so years ago. So that, you know, has not much to do with the division of mankind today. But a much later development does. As you have heard, probably, as they probably teach you here in Jawaharlal Nehru University, something took place called the Aryan invasion of India, according to the so-called Aryan invasion theory. Okay. So what this theory says is, first you had some native Indians. You had first of all this first population, you know, stemming from the original immigration from Africa. So these are the tribals, but you find very few original tribals because, at least linguistically, they were co-opted by later migrations from the east and from the west, namely from the west the Dravidians, who were of course not original Indians, who were certainly immigrants. So they came through Sindh, Gujarat, and then they populated South India, there linguistically converting the tribes, who are now, of course, the majority of the present Dravidians. And then around the Bay of Bengal, you had the Munda population, which may have been native Indian, which may have lived originally where they are now, and in Bengal and Assam and so on. And that language group also exists in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam and so on. And so it is possible that they migrated originally from India. Though we don't know that there are different schools of opinion about that. Of course, you see they have no writing. Vietnamese started maybe 1,000 years ago. In India they started only 150 years ago. For Santali, for Mundari and so on. So we don't know we know very little about it. But you know, at least you see they were in India when Vedic culture started, neutrally expressed. So, in this landscape of native Indian languages, according to the standard theory, the Indo-Europeans, or first while Aryans, intruded. They came from somewhere west. Now, this has not always been construed this way. In the 18th century, Voltaire already said, Voltaire, the French philosopher, said that the origins of European culture are to be found on the Ganges River. Then William Jones discovered that a number of language groups in Europe and in India were cognate, were similar, and had not borrowed words, but really were ancestrally united. And then, well, the then dominant opinion was that this must have come from India. Since, you know, this was one language primarily from Bengal to Ireland, it was thought originally to come from India. So the out of India theory, as it is nowadays called, is already 220 or so years old. And it preceded the Aryan invasion theory. You find, for example, in Schlegel's book, Weisheit, Leben und Weisheit der Inder, which is Life and Wisdom of the Indians, German book published in 1808, that India was the homeland, and Sanskrit the original language. Now that subsequently was a bit modified for linguistic reasons, and namely it was thought that Sanskrit was not original because it had undergone a number of changes from an original form deemed necessary to explain certain forms in Greek, Latin, and so on. Principally, the change from a number of sounds like k and g towards sh and j. And this is a kind of change you find in many languages, in many circumstances. Like, for instance, the Chinese word qi means energy. Now, originally in Chinese it was pronounced qi, and that's a form you still find in Japanese, which is borrowed the Chinese word. Or, for example, the Chinese capital is called Peking, and originally it was pronounced Peking, but today it is pronounced Beijing. You have the same in African languages, for example. All these languages, Bantu languages start with Ki, like Kikongo, Kiswahili, but Chiluba, which was originally Kiluba. Then inside a number of European languages, they were originally with K and they became Sh. For example, in Dutch, my language, we say dekker, somebody who lays a roof, a thatcher, okay? This dekker, or originally dekker, in English becomes thatcher. Yeah? Or, for example, Wicca meant a woman practicing magic. Wicca becomes English witch. And you have the same thing in Swedish and so on. Danish, for example, we say Copenhagen, but the Danish themselves say Koernaad. No, I think that's the Swedish form of. Anyway, I mean it's a Scandinavian form. Or for instance, the Norwegian city Norrköping becomes Norrköping, and so on. So it's perfectly normal, a normal language evolution, and so it has happened between reconstructed Proto-Indo-European and Sanskrit. For example, you have the form centum, which means 100 in Latin, whereas in Sanskrit you have the form shata. So ko has become shat. Of course, this is not nothing absolute about it, because in Italian, for example, which stems from Latin, this original form centum has become cento. So exactly the same as you find in Sanskrit. Okay, so you see, as Sanskrit was dethroned from the status of original mother tongue of all Indo-European languages, as Sanskrit was being dethroned, India was also dethroned. So since Sanskrit was not the mother tongue, perhaps India was not the mother country. Though initially they still thought that the original country was somewhere in the original wheat growing belt, which was from Mesopotamia through Bactria to the Indus Valley. Therefore, definitely not in Europe, nor in Russia. Then later still, other theories locate the Urheimat in Europe, either in the Balkans or even in Germany. And German nationalists especially like, of course, the theory that it was in Germany. Though, of course, the ultra-nationalist Germans, like Heinrich Himmler, the Nazi minister, located it even further west. They said that Atlantis was the Urheimat, the homeland of the Europeans. Okay, we may smile at that. But in the 1920s, a certain Gordon Chiley launched a theory that has been most popular since the Second World War, and that now still holds and that still carries the approval of most Indo-Europeanists, namely Russia around the Volga. And in the last 6 months, I've attended 4 conferences of Indo-Europeans, and I asked all of them, you see, why they thought that Russia must be the homeland. So first of all, most of them didn't care, but this is just the version that they learned in university, and this was the dominant paradigm, and they saw no reason, in their own words, of having any other opinion about it. And so for most people the question was just not interesting. But to the extent that they tried to prove their own beliefs, the answer that 95% of them came up with was, well, Russia is nicely in the middle. Between Ireland and Iceland on the one hand, and Bengal and Sri Lanka on the other, the Volga River is practically exactly in the middle. Well, yes, that is true. But, anyone an idea? What is problematic about that? Well, you see, that is not an argument for the Russian homeland. That should be an argument against it. Because all the other language groups or language families or languages that have expanded have not expanded from the middle. They've expanded from one extreme. For example, the Bantu languages, the dominant language group in Africa, started in West Africa, Nigeria somewhere, and then they went southeast, all the way to the Cape. And of course, it's also explainable why they expanded is because they had a new technology, namely agriculture. And if you practice agriculture, you can have a lot more children and have them survive, because you have more stable stocks of anything that produces livelihood that goes against famines. So the population can grow. Whereas among hunter-gatherers, the population is rather stable. So that population grew thanks to agriculture, but the factors favoring agriculture are not symmetrical. In this case, they could expand through all these fertile forested lands where it rained and so on. So that was favorable for agriculture. Whereas they could not go north, they could not expand into the Sahara, starting agriculture there, because there nothing grows. And so similarly, in every case, you can show that the factor that produced the expansion was not symmetrical. For example, the Austronesian languages are spoken from Madagascar to New Zealand, to Easter Island, Hawaii. And so in this whole island world, now this expansion was produced by another new technology, namely seafaring, but real seafaring, not just coastal navigation. And this is fairly recent, 2,000-3,000 years ago. And it started in southeastern China, Taiwan, and it went in one direction, south. And then once they were south, they could go everywhere where they could go by ship. So they went all the way to Madagascar. Madagascar is near Africa, but too far to reach by boat. Africans had no sailing, so Madagascar was totally empty of humans. So the very first humans who came there immediately populated the island. And same thing in all these islands in the, New Zealand and so on. Now, that new technology, navigation, could of course only work on the sea. Whereas if they went inland, they met the Chinese who had agriculture and so on, with a very large population, and therefore, they could go there perhaps, but then they would become Chinese. They would lose their language. And so that's what happened. So the expansion of the language group was completely asymmetrical. More recently, you have, for instance, Arabic. Started in Arabia, went all the way west to Morocco, but it did not go east, for instance, to India. You have Russian. Russian started out in Ukraine, west of Russia, present-day Russia, and then went east all the way to Alaska, and west, not at all. So, in the case of Indo-European, it just simply follows the rule. It is not far-fetched to know. On the contrary, it is extremely normal that they had to start in one extreme, namely India, and they went all the way west. Or, of course, by the same token, they may have started in Spain and gone all the way east. Only they didn't. And the reason, I think, why they went from India, why they could come from India, is that India was very populous. India already had agriculture since 9,000 years ago. And so population was growing. You can see in the Indus cities, Indus Saraswati cities I should say, that they had quite a numerous population. I mean, they had hundreds of cities. Already building a city was an exceptional thing at the time. They had hundreds of cities and they had quite a very numerous population. I mean, a far more numerous population than Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization. And so, if anything happened in India that prompted an immigration, what was a very marginal immigration in India, that practically made no difference at all to the Indians themselves, was at once a very, very remarkable immigration in Central Asia, because there the population was much more limited. Then you see once in Central Asia, well, they wanted to go on because there was nothing in Central Asia. You could keep your herds there, but that's all. There was no agriculture in Central Asia until 2000 BC, so 4,000 years ago, but that's already after the expansion of the Indo-Europeans. So what you had there was a fairly empty space where they could tend their sheep or their cows, and then they went all the way to Europe, and they settled there because there you see they had a better climate and they had agriculture again. So they went from India, they forgot about agriculture for a while, which is why in Indo-European you have very few terms for agriculture. And you see that all the terms for plants used in agriculture, pulses and grains and so on, in the European languages are borrowed from the native European languages. So there are no Indo-European words for pea, for wheat, for barley and so on. These are all borrowed. And you find many words in India for agricultural terms that you don't find in the European languages. Not because they were borrowed from Dravidian or Munda or languages that have disappeared, but that were originally Indo-European, but were forgotten during the moving of the other languages on their way from India to Europe. They were forgotten, and then once they were in Europe, they were re-adopted from the natives. And so linguistically, the case for India as homeland is quite good. It's still not very well known, but it is on the way for recognition. So that is one of my reasons for assuming that the homeland was in India, and that the Indo-Europeans were native to India. Is that clear? Because, I mean, this is a fairly technical matter, but there is a linguistic reason for thinking that India was the homeland. And I have to stress that linguistics is quite compatible with an Indian homeland, because it has now hitherto been used precisely to block any theories of an Indian homeland. For example, Dr. Ambedkar, no less, argued at length that the Aryans were native to India. And then he says somewhere, yeah, but you know, we know that the linguists have shown that the Aryans have invaded. Well, no, the linguists have not shown that. The linguists assume that, you know, in his day, but they have not shown it. And all the other evidence that he gave why the Aryans had to be Indian, that still stands. And that is not refuted by any linguistic reasoning. But so you see, very many people think, somewhere, someone has the proof somewhere. See, the linguists have the proof. Archaeologically, we cannot find the proof. There's no trace of the Aryans coming into India, and the books don't say it. The Vedas don't say that they came from elsewhere. But somewhere, maybe the linguists have the proof. But then when you go to linguistic conferences, as I have done, you still don't find the proof. On the contrary, you find many data which are only explainable if we assume that India was the homeland. And very often, people don't realize the implications of what they're saying. I mean, I have heard many times scholars who believe that Russia was the homeland say things that can only be explained if India was the homeland. I mean, so firm is the belief that Russia was the homeland. Now, I'm quite sure that Russia cannot have been the homeland. Anyway, so then what happened? The first Vedic people were native to India. Where in India? Does anyone know that? Well, you see, the Rig Veda is the oldest Veda, and it can be split into the family books and the rest. Okay? And the family books, again, are the older ones. You know, first the family books were brought together and the hymns were grouped and analyzed and put in a specific order. And then the 4 other books were added later on. Now, these 6 books, where are they? Where are they located? They say so explicitly.
Saraswati River. Saraswati River.
Yes, exactly. So the main source of livelihood of the Vedic people was the Saraswati River in Haryana. This doesn't mean that they didn't know anything else, because the very oldest layer of the Vedas speak of an ancestral river, namely the Ganga. So they came from the east, not very far from the east, from what is now western UP. As you know from the Puranas, there is a guy called Manu who survived the flood, and he landed somewhere in the Himalaya, north of UP, but east of Uttarakhand. And then he came down from his, as the sea level came lower, he descended and he settled in. Anyone? Didn't I say that Hindus don't even know Hinduism? No, this is pretty elementary. He settled in Ayodhya. And he had 10 sons or 10 descendants. 2 of whom are very important, because they found the solar dynasty and the lunar dynasty. And the solar dynasty remains there in Ayodhya. And one of the scions of the solar dynasty is Rama. Another one whom you all know is Krishna. Buddha, yes. And of course the Buddha was very proud that he was a descendant of Rama, or at least of the same family. And he considered himself a reincarnation of Rama. You know, the neo-Buddhists will tell you that, it's a scandal that these ugly, wily Hindus have concocted the theory that the Buddha was an incarnation of Vishnu. Well, in fact, you see, the very first one to say so was the Buddha himself. And it's the Buddha who said that he was a reincarnation of Rama. I mean, both Rama and the Buddha are supposed to be incarnations of Vishnu. So that's not a Hindu concoction at all. That's the Buddha himself who said it. So he was of the solar dynasty, and then you have the lunar dynasty. And after some generations in the lunar dynasty, you had Nahusha, I believe, one of them at any rate. Oh yeah, no, first say that the lunar dynasty settled in Prayag, Allahabad, which is of course not so far from the Ayodhya. At the time distances were still small, because people had no means of transport. So they had to walk all the way. One of the descendants, Nahusha, goes to the west. He settles in the Saraswati area. And then his descendant Yayati has 5 sons. And the favorite one is Kuru. And so these 5 sons are considered to be the ancestor of 5 tribes. And they are the ethnic horizon of the Rig Veda, the 5 tribes of Panchajana. Of course, there is an element of myth-making in this. Like, for instance, you have one word, Yadu. One of the sons is called Yadu. Now, Yadu is taken to be or is suspected to be a loan word from Dravidian, because there's a Dravidian word Yadu, which means goat, and they were goat herders. And today, of course, the Yadavas are deemed to be cowherds and so on. So they have something to do with the pastoralism, with cattle tending. But anyway, I mean, at least these tribes exist. And so one of these tribes, the Pauravas, are the tribe in which it happens. So they live on the Saraswati River. The other tribes spread, the Turvashus southeast, and they are never heard from again. But so they must be part of the movement to Madhya Pradesh and beyond. Then you have the Yadus, or Yadavas, going to south, Gujarat. Then you have the Druvyus going west, settling in West Punjab. And then you have the Anavas going north to Kashmir. Follow? Okay, now among the Pauravas is one fellow called Bharata, after whom India is named Bharat still. And well, he starts the Rig Veda. And it is claimed later in the Puranas that Virghatamas, one of the Vedic seers, was the court priest of Bharata. But I think that is not correct. But anyway, you see, he started the whole thing. And so the Bharata clan within the Paurava tribe is really the ethnic identity of the Vedas. And the word Arya is in fact an ethnic term meaning the Pauravas. Not really meaning the Pauravas. You see, it's like this. The word Arya means does anybody know what the word Arya means?
No.
Noble. Well, it came to mean noble at a later stage. The very first meaning of Arya, attested in Hittite, in Iranian, as well as in Vedic Sanskrit, is us, as opposed to them. So it means anyone who belongs to the same tribe, a fellow tribesman. So the Iranians call themselves Arya, and they call their Indian neighbors Anarya. Whereas the Indians call themselves Arya, and their Iranian neighbors Anarya. You see? So therefore, in the Vedas, Arya simply means us. And there are passages where allies are praised for helping the Aryas or the Pauravas in dire situations, in warfare. But they are still called Anarya because they are foreigners. And conversely, there are references to Pauravas who are so-called traitors who fight on the other side, and they are denounced. And yet they are still called Arya because they are fellow tribesmen. So, contrary to what we hear from the Hindu side, originally Arya was some kind of an ethnic term. But then you see, because Paurava culture came to mean Vedic culture, and because the Vedic culture was very prestigious, Arya came to mean Paurava for everyone else, and it came to mean Vedic. Like you have the Arya Samaj. Arya Samaj effectively means the Vedicist society. And so it came to mean noble when it came to mean superior. You see, who was superior among the non-Pauravas? those who adopt the Pauraha culture and traditions. And they stood out by wearing the sacred thread. And therefore, Arya came to mean upper caste. And you will find in the dictionary that Arya is used specifically for Vaishyas. Why? Because Kshatriyas and Brahmins had their own specific titles, whereas the Vaishyas only had the general title Arya. You can still find it today in modern society. You see professors, priests, and so on. They all have specific titles. They are called professor, they are called bishop, they are called your eminence, or whatever. Military men have specific titles, general, commander, colonel, and so on. Or politicians have titles like minister, prime minister, president, and so on. Whereas businessmen are simply called Mr. So this way also Arya is a term for the upper caste, but came to be used mostly for Vaishyas. Or it was also used by a woman addressing her husband. Arya means lord and commander or something like that. So that's where the meaning noble comes from. And by the time of the Buddha, it came to mean noble, or at least that is what most of its translators say. The Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path. Though, of course, in the case of the Buddha, I would be wary before I would say that it does not have a caste meaning. Because, when you look at the life of the Buddha, he, of course, first of all, was a very elitist person himself. If like the Neo-Buddhists have this story about, the Buddhism was a revolt against the Vedas, and it was a revolt by the natives against the Aryan invaders. Now, if that is true, then if you look at the Buddha, if anyone was an Aryan invader, it certainly was the Buddha. Descriptions of the Buddha say that he was tall, he was very white-collared, just like a Central Asian coming to India. Like later you have the Turks also coming to India. I mean, they stand out as very white and very tall. He was a Kshatriya. Age 20, he was already a senator in the Shakya Republic. He was the son of the president for life. And then he knew all the upper caste people. And that is why Buddhism became so successful. I mean, Neo-Buddhists will say, Buddhism became so successful because it was better. Wow. I mean, there were so many religions in history that were better and that were nonetheless exterminated. So that's not it. The reason why Buddhism was so successful was that the Buddha himself knew everyone. I mean, he knew all the kings and the magnates and so on, and they supported him. For example, who built the Buddhist monasteries? The monks themselves didn't build them because they were forbidden to dirty their hands. No, you see, these feudal landlords and kings and so on, they levied taxes. Now, businessmen had to pay money. But you see, workers and so on who had no money were expected to work for the king, to pay in kind, So they had to set apart like 1 month per year when they worked not for themselves, but for the king. Now, the king assigned them a certain duty, you build this bridge or what, you build this road. Now, in this case, they said, okay, you build this monastery. Because you see, I am pious, I want to do something for this wise man, the Buddha. Okay, so therefore I will build a monastery for him. Of course, I'm not going to meditate and all this, this is very nice. I'm not going to do it. But at least I will contribute by making it possible for these monks to meditate. So you go and build this monastery. And so that is why when the Buddha died, And he had a whole network of monasteries, monks and so on, very attractive. You know, any young man who wanted to do something spiritual knew where to go. It's not like the Buddha himself who went to the forest and then found some companions and so on. No, you immediately had an address, you could straight go there and become a monk. And so therefore you see Buddhism became very successful. Whereas when he began, the Buddha was just another cult leader, was just another, you know, wise man like so many others, and all the others are forgotten. Or like in Jainism, they have a very circumscribed following, but in the case of Buddhism, it became a world religion. Okay, so back to the Aryas. So the Vedic people lived on the Saraswati, and they had their northern neighbors, the Anavas, and both of them were attacked from the west by the Druhyus. But the Druhyus were defeated. And this is the very, very beginning of the Rig Veda, with King Divodasa, who defeats the Druhyus with the help of Mandaka of the Solar dynasty. So he's an eastern neighbor who comes all the way west to defeat the Druhyus. Then what do the Druhyus do? They go to the west. And it's just said in the Puranas, for what it is worth, because the Puranas are a very shaky source of history, mixture of fact and fable, and they're very much later than the Vedas. But nevertheless, they retain ancient traditions that were passed on orally. And in the case of what I'm now saying about this war with the Druhyus, that has a certain likelihood of being true because it's a genealogy. It's about their own people's prehistory. And we know, for example, from the Druids in Gaul, that this was the central part of the education. It was learning by heart the history of their own people, you know, with long lists of genealogies and so on. And so this may well be true. At any rate, it's confirmed by certain Vedic verses that you see this war took place, the Druhyus were defeated and went west. And it is also said explicitly that Gandhara found the city named after him, Kandahar, in Afghanistan. So we see them moving west and out. And it is said in the Puranas, the Druhyus went west and set up kingdoms there. So that's the Aryan phase. I mean the Aryan emigration to the west. And so then they went on, and you know, India of course loses track of them, but they appeared in Europe sometime later and became Germans and Celts and Romans and Greeks and so on. Then the Anavas come from Kashmir and they settle in West Punjab, and they are the ancestors of the Iranians. And this is very clear. One of the tribes of the Iranians is in Greek sources called the Anaoi, which is the Anavas. There are several other words like Asuras. The word Asura in the family books of the Rig Veda is a totally neutral term. It does not mean demon or anything. It's a synonym for God, for Deva. But apparently the Indians were more inclined to the Devas and the Iranians more to the Asuras. So once they really split up, once they become enemies, then the word Deva continues to mean God for the Indians, but starts to mean demon, devil in the case of the Iranians. And with Asura is the other way around. Asura or Ahura in Persian comes to mean God, and Deva comes to mean devil. So this apparently originated in a war where they both invoked the gods. In Europe, in European history, in the time of Christianity, there were many such wars where the two sides invoked God and the priests came and blessed the canon and so on. and yet only one side could get the favor from gold. Now, in this case, there must have been a battle where the Indians defeated the Iranians. And normally you see when people pray to God for victory and they don't get victory, they tend to blame themselves. They say, you know, it's because we have sinned, because we have not brought the right sacrifices to God, or so, because somehow we displeased this God. But the Iranians were made of different men. You know, they had this god Indra, the storm god, you know, the god of warfare. They had invoked Indra before the battle. They had lost, they had not received the favor of Indra. So they said, you know, Indra, you let us down, okay, we will